The coat was grey wool, double-breasted, with a collar she had turned up against the November wind on the morning she arrived at the church for Lord Pemberton's wedding. She had not been cold in the carriage. The cold arrived when she stepped out of it, the particular cold of a November morning that has been waiting for you, that meets you the moment you leave shelter and does not apologize for itself, and she had pulled the coat closer and looked up at the church's stone face and begun walking toward the entrance when she saw him. He was standing at the side of the church, in the narrow passage between the building and the low wall of the churchyard, and he was shivering in a way that had gone past the involuntary kind into the kind that happens when the body has been cold for long enough that the shivering has become structural rather than responsive, and he was young, 17 at most, wearing the livery of the Pemberton household, which was elegant and entirely inadequate for the purpose of standing outside a stone church in November for what appeared to have been some considerable time. He was holding the reins of 2 horses. The horses were stamping against the cold with the particular eloquence of animals who cannot say what they need, but know very precisely what it is. She stopped. She looked at him and at the horses and at the livery that had not been designed with November mornings in mind, and she took off her coat. She did not make a ceremony of it. She crossed to where he was standing, and she said something brief about the cold, and he said something brief about being all right, which was transparently untrue, and which she acknowledged without dwelling on by simply extending the coat toward him with the practical air of someone handing over a tool that is needed for a task, rather than making a significant gesture requiring a response proportionate to its significance. He took it. She walked into the church in the silk dress that was appropriate for a wedding in November if one was going to be inside the church, which she now was, and the November morning received her without the coat, and she did not particularly notice the absence because her attention had already moved to the next thing, which was finding her seat in the 3rd row on the left, where her family's name had been written on a small card. The Duke of Ashfordton was in the 2nd row. She did not know this yet. She knew it 40 minutes later when the wedding concluded, and the congregation began to move toward the doors, and she found herself briefly beside a man she did not know, a man in his mid-40s with the particular composed quality of someone who has been watching something for a long time rather than participating in it. And he said, with the directness of a man who does not typically make small conversation, but has decided to make an exception, that he had seen what she had done with the coat. She said it had seemed necessary. He said he had thought the same thing and had not done it, which was a more honest thing to say than most people would have said in that situation. And she looked at him with the brief and accurate attention she gave to things that deserved to be looked at clearly. And she said that the horses had seemed cold too, and that she hoped someone had thought to address that. He had been the one to address that, he said. He had spoken to the head groom about the horses after the remark made by the woman beside him in the 2nd row about the inadequacy of leaving horses standing in such weather, and the horses had been moved to the stable at the rear of the churchyard within 5 minutes of the ceremony beginning. She said she was glad. He said her coat was still on the boy in the churchyard, who had declined to give it back when asked. She said she was also glad of that. This is the story of what came after that conversation, and of the coat that passed between 3 people on a November morning and ended up meaning something that none of them could have predicted when they were standing in the cold beside a church. And it is, at its centre, the story of a man who saw something done without ceremony and found that he could not stop thinking about it, and of a woman who had no idea she had been seen, and of what it takes for 2 people to find their way from a churchyard to the same life without any of the usual machinery of such things intervening. Subscribe to this channel now and turn on the bell, because this story does not move in a straight line, and the things it says about people are said in the particular way of things that arrive sideways, and you need to be here from the beginning to understand them. She had been, by the time of Lord Pemberton's wedding, a woman who had arrived at a clear understanding of who she was and what she valued and what she was not going to pretend to value for the purpose of making other people comfortable. This was not a dramatic understanding. It had not arrived in a single moment of crisis or clarification. It had accumulated over 29 years of being precisely herself in rooms that often required her to be something slightly different. And the accumulation had produced a person who was not rigid but was honest, who knew the difference between adaptability and self-erasure, and had decided somewhere in her mid-20s that self-erasure was not a price she was willing to pay for the comfort of rooms that required it. She was from a family with a good name and a comfortable income and a general understanding of the world that was practical rather than idealistic, and she had been raised with the understanding that the world had a particular set of expectations for women of her position, and that those expectations had a certain legitimacy but also certain limits, and that the limits were hers to find and hers to maintain, and that the finding and maintaining were not optional if she was going to be a person she could respect at the end of it. She had not married. This was the fact that the world around her had been organizing its opinions about for several years, and the opinions were not unkind, but they were present, and they arrived in the form of careful questions from relations and thoughtful observations from friends and occasional direct inquiries from women who had decided that the directness was a form of care rather than intrusion. She received all of it with the composed good humor of someone who is entirely clear about her own position and does not require the position to be validated by external agreement. She was not unhappy. That was the thing the careful questions and thoughtful observations consistently failed to account for, which was that the absence of a particular social arrangement was not the same as the absence of a satisfying life, and that she had a satisfying life, genuinely satisfying, filled with the things she found genuinely interesting and the people she genuinely chose, and the work she did that she found genuinely meaningful. And the work was the kind of work that women of her position were not typically given credit for finding meaningful, which was the work of understanding the people around her and attending to what they actually needed, rather than what was convenient to offer them. She was very good at it. She had been good at it for long enough that she no longer thought of it as a skill, the way people who are genuinely musical stop thinking of music as a skill and simply experience it as a language. She read situations the way other people read text, fluently and with the particular intelligence of someone who has been doing it long enough to read the subtext as easily as the surface. She had read the boy in the churchyard immediately, not the fact of his cold, which was visible to anyone looking, but the specific combination of cold and youth and the livery that said he had been placed there by an employer who had not thought about what placing him there in November required, and the particular quality of his shivering that said he had been there long enough to have moved past the stage of hoping for relief and had settled into the stage of simply enduring, and the enduring was the thing that had moved her, because the enduring was a choice he had made without making it. The choice of a young person in a position where complaint is not available as an option, and she recognized that kind of choice, and she did not like what it required people to accept. She had given him the coat, because it was the coat she had, and it was cold, and he needed it, and she did not need it more than he did. The calculation had taken approximately 4 seconds. The Duke of Ashfordton had been watching from the second row of the church, through the narrow window to the left of the altar, which gave a partial view of the churchyard passage, and he had seen her stop, and he had seen her assess the situation, and he had seen her remove the coat and cross to where the boy was standing and extend it toward him with the economy of motion of someone who has decided what to do and is simply doing it, and the whole of it had taken perhaps 30 seconds and had been conducted without any of the elements that typically attend acts of public generosity, which were the elements of visibility and presentation and the slight performance of virtue that gestures of this kind often carry. There had been no performance. She had seen a need and filled it, and walked into the church in her silk dress and sat in the third row on the left, and the boy in the livery was warm, and the horses were still cold, and the horses were what he had done something about, which was the smallest and most accurate accounting of what each of them had contributed to the November morning before the ceremony began. He had been thinking about her for the remainder of the ceremony, which was not a thing he did in social situations as a rule, which was to say he did not typically find a single person in a social setting and allow his attention to stay on them throughout, because his attention was a managed resource, and he managed it deliberately and did not typically find social settings producing the kind of involuntary allocation of it that the woman in the third row on the left had produced. He was a man of considerable self-possession. He had developed it over 46 years of moving through the world as a man whose name and title and resources meant that the world organized itself around him rather than the reverse, and he had understood early that the organization of the world around you was not the same as the world being legible to you, and he had spent a great deal of the past 20 years trying to understand the difference. He understood people well. He understood them in the particular way of someone who has been watching them for a long time from a position that allows watching without full participation, the position of a man whose status creates a small distance between himself and the people he is among, a distance that is not chosen and is not comfortable, but that exists and that he had decided to use productively rather than pretend was not there. He watched. He was very good at watching. What he had seen in the churchyard passage in 30 seconds was something that watching had not prepared him for, which was someone doing the thing he had been about to do before she had done it, and doing it better, and doing it without the hesitation that had caused him to not do it, and doing it with the particular completeness of a person who is not thinking about the act, but simply performing it, because performing it is the natural consequence of noticing the need. He had noticed the need. He had assessed the situation and calculated what was required, and had been in the process of deciding to do it when she had simply done it. And the doing of it had been so immediate and unmediated and entirely unself-conscious that it had reorganized something in his understanding of what it looked like to be genuinely attentive to the world around you rather than efficiently attentive to it. And the reorganization had occupied him for the 40 minutes of the wedding ceremony and had followed him into the reception and had been what he was thinking about when he found himself beside her in the movement toward the door. He had spoken to her because he could not speak to her, which was a state he could not recall having been in previously in a social setting. He was always able to not speak to people. He was capable of moving through entire evenings without speaking to anyone he had not already planned to speak to. It was a quality some people found cold and others found reassuring, depending on their relationship to social obligation. And he had never experienced it as a limitation until the moment in the doorway when not speaking to her would have meant leaving without knowing what he was leaving without knowing, and he found he was not willing to do that. She had been direct with him in a way that most people were not, which was the directness of someone who is speaking to you rather than to the version of you that your position produces in other people's minds. She had said the horses had seemed cold, too, and she had said it without any of the social architecture that the observation might have carried if it had been offered by someone who was aware of being in conversation with a duke, and the absence of the architecture was itself a form of information, which was that she was simply saying what was true rather than saying what was appropriate to say to him in a situation of this kind. He had found this, standing in the doorway of the church on a November morning, with the cold coming in from outside, considerably more interesting than anything that had been said to him in recent memory. The reception was at the Pemberton House, which was 3 miles from the church, and it was large and well organized in the way of receptions hosted by families who have been hosting them for generations, and it had the particular quality of social events where the food is excellent and the company is carefully selected, and the overall atmosphere is the atmosphere of people who are comfortable with each other and with their place in the world, and who are therefore, paradoxically, slightly boring to observe. He was not bored. He was occupied, in the way he was rarely occupied at social events, which was with the specific project of understanding someone, and the someone was in his sightline for most of the afternoon, moving through the reception with the ease of a person who is genuinely comfortable in social situations rather than socially fluent in the managed way, and the distinction was visible to him in the quality of the transitions, in the way she moved from one conversation to the next, without the slight recalibration that people who are managing their social performance require between exchanges. She was not managing, she was simply present. He found her again at the edge of the garden, where she had gone briefly to look at something in the border that had caught her attention, which turned out to be a late flowering plant that she was examining with the focused interest of someone who actually knows what they are looking at. He asked what it was. She told him. He did not know the plant, and she described it with the particular pleasure of someone sharing something they find interesting rather than someone performing knowledge for an audience, and the pleasure was genuine and the description was precise, and he found himself actually interested in a late flowering garden plant, which was not something he had previously thought possible. They walked along the border for a few minutes, which was the kind of thing that happened at receptions when two people find they have more to say to each other than the setting typically accommodates and do not want to manufacture a reason for the conversation to continue, and therefore allow it to continue by simply continuing to walk. He asked her what she did, not in the social sense of the question, not what was her family and what was her position, but in the actual sense of what she did with her days, and what occupied her attention, and what she found interesting enough to pursue rather than simply encounter. She looked at him with the brief assessing quality she had, and then answered in the actual sense, which was that she spent a considerable amount of her time on the question of what could be done about the way people in dependent positions were treated by the institutions responsible for them, and that the question had grown out of a specific experience and had become over the years a general interest that she pursued through reading and through direct involvement with several organizations that were attempting to do something practical about aspects of the question. He said he was interested in the same question, in a different form, and that his form was the form of an estate holder who had been trying to understand why the institutional relationship between an estate and its dependent villages so often produced the particular combination of surface adequacy and underlying neglect that she had, apparently, also identified and found unacceptable. She said she had found it unacceptable. He said he was glad she had. The afternoon continued. He talked to other people and she talked to other people, and they were not in each other's company for the majority of the reception. But when the reception was drawing to its close and the guests were beginning to make their departures, he found her in the entrance hall with her maid and her coat, the coat having apparently been retrieved from the boy in the churchyard by her maid at some point during the afternoon, and she was putting it on in the efficient way of someone who is about to face November again and is not sentimental about the coat, but practical about the cold. And he said, before she had fully settled the collar, that he would like to call on her. She received this with the composed expression of someone who has been expecting something and is taking a moment to confirm that what has arrived is what was expected. She said she would be glad to receive a call. He called on a Thursday. The Thursday was 5 days after the Pemberton wedding, which was a shorter interval than the social conventions of the period strictly required, and a longer interval than he had been inclined toward, and the 5 days had been an exercise in the particular patience of a man who is accustomed to moving directly toward things and is trying to understand why the social architecture requires him to not do that. He came himself rather than sending a card, which was slightly unconventional and which she received without comment, but with the accurate observation, conducted privately, that coming himself rather than sending a card was the act of a man who has decided that this is not the kind of call that benefits from the intermediate step. She received him in the morning room, which was the room she used for calls that she expected to be interesting, and he sat in the chair across from her, and the call lasted for 2 hours, which was considerably longer than calls of that type typically lasted. And in the 2 hours they covered the dependent village question in some depth, and they covered the late flowering plant in the Pemberton garden and what it indicated about the gardener's approach to the seasonal sequence. And they covered the question of what honest attention to the people around you required versus what was typically offered as a substitute for it. And they covered Lord Pemberton's speech at the wedding, which had been touching but had contained an error of historical fact that both of them had noticed, and neither of them had addressed because the occasion had not required addressing it. He came back on the following Tuesday, and on the Thursday after that, the calls were becoming a pattern, which was itself a form of information for both of them, received without being stated. She was not performing anything for him. This was the thing he noticed most consistently across the 3 calls and the subsequent encounters at various gatherings over the following month, that she was simply being herself in his presence in the complete and unmodified way that people reserve for their own company or the company of people they have known for years. And the absence of modification was not indifference to his presence, but the specific comfort of someone who has assessed the situation and determined that modification would be a form of dishonesty rather than a social grace. She had assessed him. He was aware of having been assessed and was aware that the assessment was ongoing and was not troubled by it because he was doing the same thing, and the mutual assessing was producing, on both sides, a picture that was accurate rather than flattering, which was the only kind of picture either of them was interested in receiving. He told her about his first wife in December, which was not a thing he had done in 3 years of social situations, and he told her not as a declaration or a confidentiality, but as information that was relevant to understanding who he was and why he was certain ways that might otherwise require explanation, and she received it in the same register as information rather than as a weight she was required to help him carry. She asked 2 questions. Both of them were the questions of someone who wants to understand rather than someone who wants to be perceived as understanding, and the distinction was visible in the specificity of what she asked, which was specific to what he had said rather than specific to what the situation seemed to require her to be interested in. He answered both questions fully. By January they were at the stage that required naming, which they both understood without the naming being offered by either of them, because the naming required one of them to say something that the other had not yet said, and both of them were people who did not say things before the things were ready to be said. She said it first. Not dramatically and not with the architecture of a declaration. She said it in the course of a conversation about the dependent village question, specifically about a proposal she had been developing for the estate in the adjacent county that she had been working with, and she said it in the form of a question about whether he would be interested in seeing the proposal, because she had come to the conclusion that the approach might be applicable to his own estate situation, and that his perspective on the proposal would be genuinely useful to its refinement. He said he would be interested. He said it, and then he said something else, which was that he was interested in rather more than the proposal, and that he understood that was a thing that required a different kind of conversation than the one they were having, and that he was not going to have that conversation until she was prepared to have it, and that he would wait for her to indicate when that was. She looked at him. She said she was prepared to have it now, and he said that was what he had hoped she would say, and she said she had thought so, and the conversation that followed was the conversation that the Thursday calls, and the subsequent gatherings, and the December confidence, and the January proposal had been building toward. And it lasted until the light changed in the room, and her maid came to light the lamps, and they were still in the morning room, talking with the ease and precision of people who have found the register of honest conversation with each other and are in no hurry to leave it. He proposed on a Wednesday in February, which was a day that had not been chosen for its significance, and became significant because it was the day he arrived at her house, with the specific and unhurried intention of saying what needed to be said, without the performance of saying it. He sat in the morning room chair, and he said he wanted to marry her, and that he had thought carefully about whether the thought was what he believed it was, which was the conclusion of someone who has paid close attention to a specific person over several months, and has understood that the paying of attention was leading here, rather than the conclusion of a man of his age and situation for whom remarriage might have various convenient aspects that had nothing to do with the specific person in front of him, and that the conclusion he had reached was that this was the former rather than the latter, and that she was the specific reason rather than a general solution, and that he was telling her this not to make the proposal more appealing, but because it was true, and she deserved truth more than she deserved appeal. She had been very still while he said this, not the stillness of someone receiving something unexpected, but the stillness of someone who is giving what is being said the full quality of their attention, who is actually hearing it rather than waiting to respond to it. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. She said she wanted to ask him something. He said he had expected she would. She said she wanted to know what he understood marriage to require, not in the social or legal sense, but in the actual sense, what he believed the arrangement meant in practice for the two people inside it, and she was asking because she had an understanding of what it required, and she needed to know if his understanding and hers were compatible, not identical. She was not asking for identical, but compatible, which was the only version of the arrangement she was interested in. He said that was the right question. He said that what he understood it to require, in the actual sense, was the ongoing practice of genuine attention, which was attention to who the person actually was rather than to who they were convenient to have them be, and that he understood this because he had failed at it before, not completely and not without love, but in the specific way of a man who had been genuinely present in some moments and genuinely absent in others, and who had not always distinguished the difference with the honesty the distinction required, and that what he was proposing was the attempt to do it better with full awareness of what doing it better required. She received this. She thought about it with the clear, precise attention she brought to everything that deserved precision. Then she said yes. The engagement was announced in March. It was received with the particular mixture of surprise and belated inevitability that such announcements receive when the two people involved are known quantities in the social world and the pairing has not been anticipated, but seems, once announced, to have the quality of something that should have been obvious. The Pemberton wedding was mentioned in several of the subsequent accounts, because the Pemberton wedding was where they had first spoken, and in the retelling, the coat was sometimes mentioned and sometimes not, depending on who was retelling it and what they had observed from their position. Lord Alderton, who had been in the churchyard that morning and had seen her give the coat to the groom, mentioned it every time, with the particular emphasis of someone who believes that the coat is the actual beginning of the story and that everything afterward is the unfolding of what the coat revealed. The wedding was in May, which was the month she had preferred when asked, and the month he had made possible by arranging the specific church and the specific date with the particular efficiency of a man who has decided what he wants and is organizing the conditions for it, without requiring the organization to be noticed. She wore the grey coat to the church on the morning of her wedding, which was not convention and which she had chosen for reasons that she did not explain because she considered them self-evident, and the morning was May rather than November, and the coat was not necessary against the cold, but was present anyway, and he had seen the coat through the window as her carriage arrived, and had understood, with the simple and complete understanding of a man who has been paying close attention for 7 months, exactly what the coat was doing there. The ceremony was what ceremonies are when the two people in them have arrived at them honestly, which is to say it was not particularly remarkable from the outside, but had the interior quality of something being meant, and the meaning was visible in the quality of attention both of them brought to the words and to each other. And the vicar, who had conducted a great many ceremonies of this kind, noted to his wife afterward that the couple had been looking at each other in the particular way of people who are actually present to what is happening rather than performing their presence to it, and that it was less common than it should be and pleasant to see. The groom, from the November morning, was in the congregation. She had arranged this, quietly, through a conversation with the Pemberton household, and he had come with the slight formality of someone attending a significant occasion and the slight bewilderment of someone who has been included in a significant occasion without a clear understanding of why, and she had not explained the why to him and did not explain it at the ceremony because the explanation was not necessary. He had been cold in November, and she had given him her coat, and here they all were in May, and the connection was visible if you knew to look for it, which very few people did, and that was precisely as it should be. She came out of the church in the grey coat with the collar turned up, which was not against November cold this time, but simply the way she wore it when she wore it. And he was beside her with the quality of beside that is different from the quality of adjacent, which is the quality of two people who have decided to be where they are rather than simply arrived there. And the May morning was everything May mornings are when they are being accommodating, which is to say it was warm enough and clear enough and had the specific quality of a morning that is not going to apologize for being exactly what it is. He said something to her at the carriage, quietly, which was that she had worn the coat and she said she had thought it was appropriate, and he said he thought so too. And neither of them said more than that, because more than that was not required. And the carriage moved and the May morning continued, and the grey coat, which had been given to a shivering boy in a churchyard in November and retrieved by a maid in the afternoon and worn to a wedding in May, was in the carriage with the two people who had found each other because of it, and the finding had been quiet and honest and entirely their own. She had not given the coat to be noticed. She had given it because it was cold, and he needed it, and she did not need it more than he did. And the calculation had taken 4 seconds, and the 4 seconds had produced 7 months and a May morning, and a life that was, she was finding in the first days of it, the life that resulted when two people with clear eyes and compatible understandings of what things required decided to build something together on that basis. It was not a fairy tale. It was better than that. It was two people who had both been paying attention to the world and to what the world required, and who had found in each other the specific person who paid attention in ways that were recognizable and valuable and genuine, and who had decided that the finding was worth the building, and who were building accordingly, carefully and without performance, which was the only way either of them knew how to do anything that actually mattered. Leave a like if this story reached you. It tells us that these stories deserve to exist. Subscribe to this channel and turn on the bell so the next story finds you from the beginning, because they are always better experienced whole. from the grey coat in November to the May morning and everything the distance between them contains. And if you know someone who gives their coat in November without making it a ceremony, share this with them today. They are exactly the kind of person this story was made for.